My name is Margot Ellison. I'm 29 years old. And the night of my brother's rehearsal dinner was when I finally understood that being removed from something and being free of it are sometimes the same event. My father stood up before the salad course at the Harwell Vineyards private dining room and said, in a voice he had clearly decided deserved an audience, "I want to say something while the family is together. I have made a decision about my estate, and I think it should be known. Margot will not be included. She has done nothing to deserve what this family has built, and I will not pretend otherwise." 41 people. Long pine tables set with candles. My brother Daniel at the head of the table with his fiancée Reese, whose expression shifted from celebration to a careful blankness in less than a second. My Aunt Vivian at the far end, whose fork stopped moving. I did not push back my chair. I did not look at my father. I picked up the small card in front of my place setting, the one with the rehearsal dinner menu printed on it in a serif font, turned it over, and set it back down face down on the cloth. What none of them knew, not my father, not Daniel, not the 40 guests who had just heard my father's announcement, was that 4 days earlier a woman named Frances Okafor, who had been my grandmother's estate attorney for 16 years, had filed an amendment to my grandmother Iris Ellison's revocable living trust. The amendment had been executed 3 weeks before my grandmother died. It named me as primary beneficiary of a specific set of assets my grandmother had spent 31 years building, separate from anything my father controlled or had ever been asked to approve. My father did not know about the amendment because my grandmother had not told him about it. My grandmother had not told him because she had known, with the precision of a woman who had watched her son for 6 decades, exactly what he would do if she had. I want to explain the family before I explain the documents, because the documents do not make sense without the family. My grandmother Iris was the kind of woman who made decisions carefully and implemented them quietly. She had grown up in a household where money was discussed in terms of what it could prevent rather than what it could provide, and she had carried that frame into a business she built over 31 years, a regional property management company that she started with a single rental unit in 1979 and grew, through deliberate acquisition and maintenance and the refusal to overleverage, into a portfolio of 47 residential units across 3 counties. She did not advertise this. She did not discuss it at family dinners. When people asked what she did, she said she managed some properties, which was true the way saying a river carries some water is true. My father, her son, knew the business existed. He had worked in it briefly in his late 20s, during a period when he was between positions and needed income, and had lasted 14 months before a disagreement about how to handle a difficult tenant. He wanted to pursue immediate eviction. My grandmother believed in a documented warning process that she had used successfully for 2 decades, ended his involvement. He did not speak badly of the business after that. He simply treated it as a thing that had not worked out, the way people treat things that have not worked out when the alternative is acknowledging why. My mother, who had died when I was 11, had been the person in the family most able to navigate between my father's sense of his own authority and the reality that it was not always warranted. After she was gone, that navigation fell to me, not because I was the oldest, Daniel was 3 years older, but because I was the one who found it easier to absorb friction without producing more of it. Daniel had inherited my father's preference for declarative statements. I had inherited something else, which I did not have a word for until much later, and which I now understand was simply patience used as a skill rather than a posture. My grandmother noticed this. She noticed most things. I had started working with her business in a limited way when I was 22, fresh out of a property management certification program that she had quietly suggested I consider, and then paid for without making a point of it. I began as an assistant property coordinator, scheduling maintenance, processing applications, organizing lease renewals. Within 2 years, I was managing a subset of the portfolio directly, handling everything from tenant communications to contractor relationships to the quarterly financial summaries my grandmother reviewed at her kitchen table on the first Monday of every month. I was not paid above the market rate. I was not given equity. I was given the work and the trust that came with it, which at the time I understood as generosity, and which I later understood was also something else. She was watching me to see what I did with it. My father did not approve of my involvement in the business, and he said so on several occasions, in terms that were clear enough to understand but indirect enough to ignore. His position was that I was being used, that my grandmother was getting capable labor at a discount because I was too devoted to her to negotiate properly. He said this with the confidence of a man who had tried and failed at the same work for 14 months and attributed the failure entirely to a disagreement over tenant policy. I did not argue with him. I went to work. The business Daniel was building, a residential construction firm that my father had invested in heavily during its first 3 years, was the real center of my father's financial attention. Daniel had a way of presenting plans that made my father feel included in their authorship, which was a genuine skill and not a manipulative one. Daniel believed in what he was building and communicated that belief fluently. My father had put $340,000 into the firm across 3 rounds of informal investment, structured as loans that were not documented with a specificity that would have made them legally enforceable. This was not unusual in family business arrangements. It was, however, the kind of arrangement that creates an invisible ledger of obligation that influences decisions in ways that are difficult to account for later. I did not know the exact amount of my father's investment in Daniel's firm until much later. What I knew was that my father's relationship with Daniel had a particular quality, a warmth that was partly genuine and partly functional, the warmth of a person who has put significant resources into something and needs it to succeed. My relationship with my father had a different quality. It had always been quieter. Not hostile, he was not unkind in the ordinary exchanges of family life. But there was a consistent pattern, observable across years, in which my work was described in terms of what it lacked: ambition, scale, visibility, while Daniel's was described in terms of what it promised. I had a job that managed other people's properties. Daniel was building something. The distinction was delivered without malice, which made it harder to address than malice would have been. My grandmother watched all of this. She said very little about it to me directly. What she did, over the last 4 years of her life, was give me increasing responsibility in the business, and in parallel, speak more frequently with Frances Okafor. I did not know the content of those conversations until after she died. My grandmother Iris died on a Tuesday in late October, 18 months before my brother's rehearsal dinner. She was 82. The cause was a cardiac event that her cardiologist, Dr. Bennett Marsh at Ridgeline Medical Group, had been monitoring for 2 years and had described to her, at her last appointment, as a condition that could remain stable for years or resolve quickly, and that she should consider her affairs accordingly. She had apparently been considering them for some time before that appointment. The week after the funeral, Frances Okafor contacted me by phone. She said she was handling the estate and asked me to come to her office the following Thursday. I assumed this was standard procedure, a meeting to discuss the trust distribution, which I expected would involve the business assets going to my father and a modest personal bequest to Daniel and me. That was the structure I had understood the trust to have, based on nothing more specific than the general family understanding that my grandmother's business would eventually pass to my father. Frances Okafor's office was in a professional building on the east side of the city, 3rd floor, with a view of a parking structure. She was 54, precise in her presentation, and had the manner of someone who had delivered estate news of all varieties and had learned to begin with the facts rather than the context. She told me that my grandmother had amended her trust 3 weeks before she died. The amendment had been executed properly, witnessed, notarized, filed. It superseded the prior distribution structure in specific ways. My grandmother had transferred ownership of 11 of the 47 residential units, the ones she had acquired earliest, the original core of the portfolio, with a combined assessed value of $2,170,000, into a separate subtrust with me as sole beneficiary. The remaining 36 units remained in the main trust, which distributed to my father. The amendment also included a specific cash account of $183,000, separately held also to me. Frances had a copy of the amendment. She slid it across the desk. I looked at it for a moment without picking it up. Then I picked it up. My grandmother had written a brief letter of instruction to accompany the amendment, which Frances read to me rather than having me read it myself, which I later understood was a courtesy she extended when the content was significant. The letter said, in my grandmother's characteristic impression, the 11 properties represent the work I am most certain about. I am leaving them to the person I am most certain about. The reasons do not require explanation, but I will say one. I have watched Margot do the work correctly for 7 years without asking for recognition, and I know what that means about a person. I set the amendment back on Francis Okafor's desk. I said, "When does my father find out?" She said, "He will receive his portion of the trust documentation within the week. The amendment is part of the public record as of the filing date." I said, "Does he know yet?" She said, "He has not yet received the full file." I sat with that for a moment. Through the window, the parking structure was the same gray it had been when I arrived. I said, "What do I need to do?" She said, "Nothing immediately. The trust is already filed. Your responsibility begins when you choose to assume management of the 11 units, which can happen on your timeline." I thanked her. I drove home. I sat in my car in the parking garage of my apartment building for 11 minutes, which I know because I checked the time when I pulled in and again when I went inside, and then I went upstairs and made dinner and did not call anyone. The rehearsal dinner was on a Friday evening in early March, 18 months after my grandmother's funeral. The intervening period had been quiet in the way that a document quietly filed is quiet, present and real and waiting, without requiring anything of the moment. My father had received his portion of the trust documentation and had, apparently, interpreted the amendment as a clerical adjustment or a minor carve-out rather than what it was. He had not contacted Francis Okafor for clarification.
He had not contacted me.
He had, according to my Aunt Vivian, who mentioned it once in passing over coffee and then did not raise it again, expressed the view that my grandmother had been overly sentimental in her last decisions, which was his way of categorizing things he disagreed with without engaging their substance. In those 18 months, I had assumed management of the 11 units. I had done this the same way I had done everything in the business, quietly, systematically, without announcement. I had coordinated with the existing maintenance contractors, reviewed the lease agreements, made 2 decisions about problematic tenants that my grandmother would have made the same way, and begun a reserves account for deferred maintenance on 3 of the older units. I had spoken with Francis Okafor 4 times about administrative matters. I had not spoken with my father about any of it. Daniel's rehearsal dinner was held at Harwell Vineyard, 40 minutes north of the city, in their private event space, a long room with exposed beams and pine tables that seated up to 50. Reese's family had rented the space for the evening. The guest list was 41 people, both families, the wedding party, close friends. I had been invited because I was Daniel's sister, which was the only reason required. I arrived alone. I wore a dark green dress that had belonged to my mother, altered to fit me, which I wore to family events sometimes because it was the kind of thing that required no explanation to the people who recognized it and no explanation to the people who didn't. I was seated at the middle of the main table between my cousin Thomas and a college friend of Reese's named Alicia, who worked in landscape architecture and spoke with genuine enthusiasm about soil drainage systems, which I found I could follow without difficulty. My father was at the head-adjacent position, near Daniel and Reese. He had driven up with his wife, a woman named Diane he had married 4 years ago and who had the careful manner of someone who has learned to read the weather of a family and position herself accordingly. I had a functional relationship with Diane, not warm, not hostile, navigated with mutual confidence. The dinner began at 7. The first course arrived. Reese's father gave a brief welcome. Daniel stood and said something about Reese that was both true and genuinely felt, and I watched Reese's face while he said it. Between the welcome and the salad, my father stood. He did not have a glass raised. He did not begin with a toast. He began with, "I want to say something while the family is together," and the room adjusted to the particular silence of people who have understood that what is coming is not a celebration.
He said what he said. He used the word deserved.
He looked at me once while he said it, directly, the way someone looks at a point they are making rather than a person they are addressing. I picked up the menu card in front of my place setting, turned it over, and set it back down. I did not look at him. I did not look at Daniel. Alicia, beside me, had gone very still. Thomas had put down his fork. My Aunt Vivian, at the far end of the table, set down her wine glass with a precision that was quieter than silence. That was all I registered in the moment because I was not collecting reactions. I was waiting for the moment to be over, which it was in approximately 45 seconds, when my father sat back down and the room held its breath for another 10 seconds and then resumed, unevenly, the way rooms resume after something has happened that everyone present has understood, and no one is ready to name. My father sat down believing he had made a statement that would stand. What he had not accounted for was Francis Okafor's filing date. The amendment to my grandmother's trust had been filed 4 days before the rehearsal dinner. It was a matter of public record. It had been filed correctly, witnessed, notarized, and entered into the probate court's document system. It named me. The 11 units were mine. The $183,000 account was mine. These were not things my father could revoke, or contest with reasonable prospect of success, or reframe as sentimental error. They were executed documents, prepared by a 16-year attorney-client relationship, based on a decision my grandmother had made with full legal capacity 3 weeks before she died. And they had been in the system for 4 days before he stood up at a vineyard rehearsal dinner and told 41 people I had earned nothing. I did not say any of this at the dinner. I ate the salad. I had a conversation with Alicia about a drainage project she had worked on near the coast that had required an unusual combination of native plantings and engineered stone, which was genuinely interesting. I spoke briefly with Reese's mother, who was warm and a little nervous and who wanted the wedding to go well. I said goodnight to Daniel at the end of the evening, which was a brief and ordinary exchange. My father and I did not speak at the dinner. He did not approach me. I did not approach him. The document already existed. It did not require me to do anything. What happened over the following 3 months did not happen because of anything I did. Diane, my father's wife, had a brother named Carl who worked in commercial real estate and who understood, at a level of professional competence that my father apparently did not, what a filed trust amendment meant. Carl had been at the rehearsal dinner. He had heard my father's announcement. At some point in the week following the dinner, Carl had looked up the trust filing, which was public record and required nothing more than a county records search. He then had a conversation with Diane that she later described to my Aunt Vivian, who relayed it to me without embellishment, as a long one. My father contacted Francis Okafor's office 12 days after the rehearsal dinner. Francis confirmed the filing and its contents. She confirmed that the amendment had been properly executed, that its validity was not in question, and that the distribution it specified was legally binding. My father retained his own attorney, a man named Stephen Glatt at a firm that handled estate litigation, and Stephen Glatt reviewed the amendment and its execution record and told my father, in whatever terms estate litigators use for this situation, that the document was sound and that a contest would be unlikely to succeed and costly to pursue. My father did not pursue a contest. What he did instead was call Daniel, apparently multiple times, over the following 2 weeks. Daniel told me about these calls later, in a conversation I had not expected and for which I did not have a prepared frame. Daniel said that my father had been, in his word, shaken, not by the legal facts, which he had eventually accepted, but by the letter. My grandmother's letter of instruction, which Francis had included in the distributed file, had been read by my father in its entirety. The sentence that had produced the most difficulty, according to Daniel, was the last one. I know what that means about a person. Daniel said, he kept coming back to that line. I said, what did he say about it? Daniel said he didn't understand what she meant. I did not say anything to that immediately. I thought about my grandmother at her kitchen table on the first Monday of every month, reviewing the quarterly summaries in silence, occasionally writing a note in the margin, occasionally simply closing the folder and starting the coffee. I said, I think he understood. I think that was the difficulty. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I didn't know she'd done that. The amendment. I said, I know. He said, I should have said something at the dinner. I said, you didn't know. He said, I knew enough. That was the most honest conversation Daniel and I had ever had, and it lasted approximately 4 minutes, and it changed something between us in a way that I have not fully mapped yet, but that I notice in the texture of our conversations now, which are slightly less careful than they used to be. The wedding was in May, 2 months after the rehearsal dinner. I attended. It was the correct thing to do, and also, separately, something I wanted to do. Reese was a person I had come to respect, and her family had treated me with the ordinary warmth of people who had not been briefed on the internal arrangements of someone else's family. I wore a different dress. I sat in the third row. I watched Daniel and Reese exchange their vows with the attention they deserved. My father and I occupied the same space for 6 hours without speaking directly. We were proximate at the reception, seated at adjacent tables, and managed the proximity with the practiced neutrality of two people who have understood that the alternative to managed neutrality is a scene, and that a scene at someone else's wedding is a cost neither of us was willing to impose on Daniel and Reese. Diane caught my eye once during the reception, briefly, with an expression I could not fully read, but which contained something that was not hostility. I nodded. She looked away. My Aunt Vivian sat with me during the cake cutting and told me, without preamble, that my grandmother had talked about me in the last year of her life more than I probably knew. She said she was proud of specific things, not general things. She didn't do general. I said, no, she didn't. Vivian said, the quarterly summaries. She told me once she could see her handwriting in the margins and it looked like hers. I held that for a moment. I said, she never told me that. Vivian said, she wouldn't. That's not how she expressed things. I understood that completely. 14 months after the rehearsal dinner, the 11 units were operating at a margin I was satisfied with. I had made 3 significant maintenance investments in the older properties, a roofing project on 2 adjacent units that had been deferred for 2 years, and a full plumbing update on a third that had needed it since my grandmother acquired it. The combined cost was $218,000, drawn from the reserves account I had been building since I assumed management. The units were more stable than they had been. The tenants in the roofed units had both renewed their leases. I had not spoken with my father since the rehearsal dinner. He had not attempted contact. This was not, I thought, indifference. It was the particular silence of a person who has said something in a public room that the room did not receive the way they intended, and who has not yet found the frame in which to address that fact. I did not know if that frame would ever arrive. I had made a private decision not to require it before I was ready to receive it, and I was not ready. My relationship with Daniel had continued its slow recalibration. We had dinner twice, separately from family events, which had not been a pattern between us before. The conversations were still careful, but less performed. He had started asking me real questions about the business, not from interest in the assets, I thought, but from a belated curiosity about the work I had been doing that he had not paid attention to before. I answered the questions. I did not make a point of the fact that he was asking them now. Frances Okafor and I had a professional relationship that had become, in a quiet way, also something adjacent to cordial. She had known my grandmother for 16 years. She knew certain things about my family that I had not told her and that she had not asked about, and she managed that knowledge with the discretion of someone who understood what it was for. At our last meeting, she had mentioned, in passing, that my grandmother had used the phrase "most certain about" in only 2 other places in 31 years of estate planning, once referring to a piece of land she had sold, and once referring to the maintenance contractor she had used for 20 years. I thought about that for a while after I left Frances's office. My grandmother had spent 31 years building a portfolio. She had amended her trust 3 weeks before she died. She had used a phrase she reserved for things she had fully decided about. I was the third thing she had been most certain about.
That is not a small thing.
I am still learning what to do with it, which I think is the correct response, because the alternative is to assume you already know, and she spent a long time demonstrating what it looks like when someone actually does. There is a thing I have come to understand about being dismissed, which is that dismissal only has the power you allow it to locate. My father stood up at a pine table in a vineyard dining room and told 41 people I had earned nothing. He said it with conviction. He had probably been building towards saying it for years, and a rehearsal dinner with the whole family present had seemed, to him, like the correct occasion. What he did not know was that the document had already been filed, that my grandmother had already said what she thought, in the precise and legally binding language of a woman who did not do general things, that the work I had done for 7 years was already reflected in a set of records that did not require his approval and were not subject to his revision. Dismissal requires you to agree that the person doing the dismissing has the authority to define your worth. My grandmother had spent 31 years deciding who had that authority over what she had built. She had made her decision 3 weeks before she died and filed it correctly and left me the work she was most certain about. What my father said at the rehearsal dinner was loud. What my grandmother had already done was permanent. Loud and permanent are not the same thing. I have learned to tell the difference, and I have learned not to spend energy arguing with loud when permanent is already on the record. I want to ask you something specific before I go. The moment I keep returning to is not my father standing up at the table. It is not the morning Francis Okafor read my grandmother's letter to me across her desk. It is Vivian at the reception, telling me that my grandmother had seen her handwriting in the margins of my summaries. My grandmother never said that to me directly. She let me believe the work was sufficient on its own terms, without telling me she was watching it. The decision she made, the amendment, the filing, the letter, was the only way she expressed that kind of certainty because that was the language she used. If you watch someone build something for 31 years and then leave the most important piece of it to you without explaining why, what would you do with that? Leave it in the comments. I read everyone. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. A new story every week, same day, same time. And if you know someone who has been told they've earned nothing by someone who never did the accounting, share this with them. Sometimes the record already exists. They just haven't seen it yet. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you next week.